In 1933, amid the chaos of the Great Depression, the United States was facing a financial system on the brink of collapse. Banks were failing in waves, unemployment had soared past 25%, and faith in the US dollar, once considered unshakable, had evaporated. Into this crisis stepped Franklin D. Roosevelt, newly inaugurated and armed with sweeping ambitions to reshape America's economic order. Among his earliest and most controversial moves was a little-remembered provision buried within the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the Thomas Amendment. Named after Senator Elmer Thomas of Oklahoma, the Thomas Amendment was a legislative bombshell that gave the president unprecedented power over the nation's money supply. It effectively authorized Roosevelt to inflate the dollar at will, a stunning departure from the traditional gold-based discipline that had defined American finance for nearly a century. But before diving into what the Thomas Amendment actually did, let's set the stage. The early 1930s weren't just an economic downturn, they were a full-blown systemic collapse. The Federal Reserve, barely 20 years old, had failed to act as a lender of last resort. As deflation gripped the economy, prices fell by nearly a third, crushing debtors and farmers. Agricultural prices had plunged so low that wheat and cotton were often cheaper to burn than to sell. Millions of Americans couldn't pay their mortgages or taxes, leading to mass foreclosures and social unrest. It was in this environment that the Roosevelt administration searched for radical tools to reverse the deflationary spiral. The gold standard, long considered the backbone of monetary stability, had become a straitjacket. By tying the value of the dollar to gold, the U.S. had effectively locked itself into a deflationary trap. The Thomas Amendment aimed to break that chain. Here was what made it extraordinary. It gave the president the authority to alter the gold content of the dollar issue, new paper currency backed by silver or government bonds, and even nationalize the Federal Reserve's control of monetary policy. In other words, Roosevelt could unilaterally change the definition of money itself. Imagine that today, a law that allows the president to decide at any moment how much a dollar is worth. It sounds almost dictatorial, and in 1933, many in Congress and the financial community thought exactly that. But to Roosevelt and his advisors, this was nothing less than economic warfare. And desperate times, they argued, demanded desperate measures. The Thomas Amendment contained four main inflationary powers. 1. Revalue gold. The president could reduce the gold content of the dollar by up to 50%, effectively devaluing the currency and increasing prices. 2. Issue silver-backed currency. The U.S. could mint new silver coins or issue silver certificates, reviving bimetallism. 3. Issue greenbacks. The president could authorize up to $3 billion in new paper money backed only by government credit. 4. Direct Federal Reserve policy. The president could assume direct control over the Federal Reserve's credit operations, centralizing monetary power in the executive branch. At its core, the Thomas Amendment was a direct challenge to the very concept of sound money. Yet, for Roosevelt, it wasn't about ideology, it was about survival. The deflationary collapse was destroying farms, factories, and families, and the government needed tools that could move fast and decisively. And so, in May 1933, the Thomas Amendment became law. Few Americans paid attention. It was overshadowed by Roosevelt's famous fireside chats and massive public works programs. But behind the scenes, it quietly changed the course of U.S. monetary history. Within months, Roosevelt began to use his new powers. He suspended the gold standard, banned private gold ownership, and ordered all gold to be turned into the government. By early 1934, under the authority the Thomas Amendment provided, he devalued the dollar by raising the price of gold from $20.67 to $35 per ounce, a 69% increase. Overnight, the U.S. currency lost nearly half its international value, but the domestic effect was exactly what Roosevelt hoped for. Prices began to rise, farm incomes recovered, and economic activity started to revive. But this wasn't just a domestic issue. The devaluation had enormous global consequences. Foreign governments that had pegged their currencies to gold or to the dollar suddenly faced chaos. The British pound and French franc wobbled, international trade contracts had to be rewritten, and Wall Street's financial elite seethed at the idea that the president could unilaterally rewrite the rules of money. Yet, as radical as the Thomas Amendment seemed, it became the legal backbone for nearly every major monetary policy experiment that followed in the 20th century. From the Gold Reserve Act to the Bretton Woods system and eventually the fiat dollar era we live in today. To truly understand the significance of the Thomas Amendment, we need to look at its political and philosophical roots. Senator Elmer Thomas, its author, was not an economist from the ivory tower. He was a populist politician from Oklahoma, a state devastated by collapsing crop prices and rural poverty. Farmers were drowning in debt, and their biggest enemy wasn't just the banks, it was deflation. Every bushel of wheat they sold brought in fewer dollars, but their loans remained fixed. Thomas had long been an advocate of cheap money, a term that carried revolutionary undertones in the 1930s. It meant loosening the money supply, printing more dollars, and pushing up prices to make debts easier to pay. The idea wasn't new. It echoed the populist battles of the late 19th century between silverites and goldbugs. The silverites, often rural and agricultural, argued that money should be plentiful, while the gold standard crowd, bankers and industrialists, believed that hard money was the foundation of civilization itself. By the 1930s, the gold standard's discipline was seen as suicide. Prices had collapsed by over 30% between 1929 and 1933. Factories shut down because nobody could afford to buy goods. Wages fell, but debts didn't. The Thomas Amendment became a weapon to reflate the economy, to deliberately reverse deflation through controlled inflation. Yet, this plan faced enormous opposition. Bankers, gold standard purists, and even some within Roosevelt's own administration were horrified. Treasury Secretary William Wooden warned that tampering with the gold content of the dollar would destroy faith in the currency. Economists like Irving Fisher disagreed. They believed mild inflation was the only path to recovery. Roosevelt sided with Fisher. The political struggle over the Thomas Amendment revealed a deeper truth. The battle for control of money is the battle for control of the economy itself. For the first time in American history, the president had the legal right to intervene directly in the definition of money. Before 1933, such decisions were the exclusive realm of the market and the Federal Reserve. After the Thomas Amendment, money became a political instrument, something the government could manipulate to achieve policy goals. This marked a turning point. When Roosevelt used his powers to devalue the dollar in early 1934, he wasn't merely changing numbers, he was changing the very foundation of trust on which the financial system rested. Yet, strangely enough, this managed currency approach worked. Prices stopped falling and the stock market began to rise. The economy, though still weak, started to breathe again. Still, the long-term implications were immense. The Thomas Amendment effectively blurred the line between monetary policy and fiscal policy. In previous eras, money was considered a neutral tool. Gold and silver were objective, tangible, and politically untouchable. After 1933, that neutrality was gone. The dollar became a creature of government policy, elastic, flexible, and subject to the president's will. This shift also revealed something profound about power. For decades, bankers had controlled the flow of credit. But now, the White House had assumed that authority. Roosevelt had centralized the monetary system in a way no president before him dared to. The Federal Reserve, which was supposed to be independent, was effectively sidelined. Its policies were dictated by executive orders and Treasury directives. And while that might sound authoritarian, for many Americans, it was a relief. The Depression had discredited the financial elite. Ordinary citizens didn't trust Wall Street or the Fed. They trusted Roosevelt, the man who promised to fight for the forgotten man. But there's a dark side to this newfound power. Once the government learns it can manipulate the money supply to achieve short-term gains, it rarely stops. The Thomas Amendment didn't just save the economy in 1933, it also laid the groundwork for decades of monetary inflation that followed. The United States had discovered the political convenience of printing money. In the years after the Depression, this mindset became permanent. When faced with recessions, wars, or political crises, Washington's instinct was to spend and inflate rather than deflate and balance. What began as a desperate emergency measure became the default strategy of modern governance. And perhaps most ironically, the Thomas Amendment, originally meant to empower farmers and small debtors, ended up concentrating monetary power at the very top. Over time, the Federal Reserve regained its autonomy, but the precedent remained. When push comes to shove, political leaders could and would override economic orthodoxy. Even more fascinating is how the Thomas Amendment shaped the psychology of money. Before the 1930s, Americans viewed money as something objective, a fixed measure like a ruler or a scale. After the amendment, money became subjective, a tool to be managed, adjusted, and engineered. This subtle shift changed how people, institutions, and governments thought about value itself. Fast forward to today, and we can still trace our fiat money system back to this single moment. The Thomas Amendment didn't just authorize inflation, it normalized it. It created the legal and moral justification for what would later become quantitative easing, debt monetization, and even modern monetary theory, MMT. The 1933 Law S language was vague but powerful. It allowed the president to take such action as he deems necessary to stabilize the dollar. And that phrase, as he deems necessary, was practically limitless. In practice, it meant the executive branch could redefine money anytime it wanted, with or without congressional approval. It is no exaggeration to say that the Thomas Amendment was the seed from which modern central banking grew. While Roosevelt didn't exercise all of its powers, for example, he didn't issue $3 billion in new greenbacks, the authority remained on the books for decades. It became a dormant but ever-present reminder that monetary sovereignty could be exercised unilaterally. And though few remember Senator Elmer Thomas today, his legacy lives in every inflationary policy, every stimulus program, and every monetary intervention that's followed since. By 1934, the consequences of the Thomas Amendment were already rippling across the global economy. Roosevelt's bold monetary experimentation had broken the sacred taboo of the gold standard, and the world was watching with a mix of shock and awe. America, once the bastion of sound money, had just legalized inflation, and its president was openly setting the price of gold like a commodity trader. Under the authority granted by the Thomas Amendment, Roosevelt began a series of gold revaluations that culminated in the Gold Reserve Act of 1934. He declared that the new official price of gold would be $35 per ounce, up from the previous $20.67. Overnight, the dollar was devalued by roughly 40%, meaning every ounce of gold the U.S. government held was suddenly worth nearly twice as much in dollar terms. This was a political masterstroke disguised as economic policy. With one move, Roosevelt boosted the paper value of America's gold reserves and effectively injected new money into the system without printing a single note. It was inflation by decree, and it worked. Prices began to rise, debt burdens lightened, and the deflationary spiral was broken. But for investors, savers, and foreign nations holding dollars, the message was chilling. The U.S. government had just proven that the value of its money was whatever it said it was. Gold, once a neutral arbiter of value, had been subordinated to political will. This is where the Thomas Amendment's true genius and danger lay. It didn't specify a fixed formula for adjusting the dollar. It gave the president flexibility, total flexibility. Roosevelt could, at any time, alter the relationship between the dollar and gold, issue new silver certificates, or even flood the economy with greenbacks. In a sense, the amendment transformed the dollar into a prototype of the modern fiat currency, not backed by metal, but by confidence and decree. And while this newfound freedom helped save America from the Great Depression, it also introduced a long-term addiction, the addiction to monetary manipulation. Every future crisis, from the 1970s inflation to the 2008 financial meltdown, would see leaders turn to the same basic playbook: alter the money supply, adjust interest rates, and inflate the problem away. Back in the 1930s, the reaction wasn't universally positive. Conservative newspapers accused Roosevelt of currency debauchery. Business leaders warned that America was on a slippery slope toward socialism. Internationally, European central bankers were furious. The British, who had abandoned gold 2 years earlier, saw America's move as both validation and betrayal. Validation that leaving gold worked, but betrayal that the world's largest economy was now competing in a race to devalue. The ripple effects were immense. Other nations soon followed suit, creating a global currency war. Each country sought to make its exports cheaper by weakening its currency. This policy, known as beggar thy neighbor, was destructive but irresistible. In a world of shrinking demand, devaluation became the only competitive tool left. Yet behind the economic chaos, something deeper was happening, a philosophical transformation. The Thomas Amendment had quietly erased the centuries-old notion that money must be rooted in something physical. For thousands of years, money had always been tied to metal, first silver, then gold. The amendment declared that stability could be achieved through management, not metal. This shift in thinking paved the way for Keynesian economics, which would dominate the 20th century. John Maynard Keynes himself praised Roosevelt's courage, calling his abandonment of the gold standard magnificently right. To Keynesians, the Thomas Amendment was proof that governments could and should manage demand through monetary tools. However, not everyone saw it that way. Hard money advocates, the descendants of the old gold standard camp, viewed the amendment as the original sin of modern finance. They argued that by politicizing money, Roosevelt had planted the seeds of endless inflation and moral hazard. Once you teach politicians they can print or devalue their way out of debt, restraint becomes impossible. History would prove them at least partially right. After the Thomas Amendment, the U.S. government learned that manipulating money could solve short-term problems, but at a long-term cost. The purchasing power of the dollar, which had remained remarkably stable for over a century before 1933, began its century-long decline. What a dollar could buy in 1930 would require more than $20 by the end of the century. Still, it's impossible to deny that Roosevelt's policies, empowered by the Thomas Amendment, worked in the short run. They restored confidence, reactivated credit markets, and stabilized farm incomes. America, once paralyzed by deflation, began moving again. But here's where the real story turns. While most Americans think of the Thomas Amendment as a Depression-era emergency law, its provisions had effects that extended far beyond Roosevelt's presidency. The authority it granted remained on the books until 1947, long after the crisis had passed. During World War II, it provided legal cover for massive wartime inflation and monetary expansion. In essence, it permanently altered the relationship between the U.S. government, the Federal Reserve, and the value of the dollar. Even more importantly, it created the precedent of executive control over money. Before the 1930s, monetary policy was primarily the domain of Congress and the Federal Reserve. After 1933, the president himself could dictate policy by decree. This set the stage for later executive interventions, such as Nixon's 1971 decision to close the gold window, effectively ending the Bretton Woods system. It's a straight line from the Thomas Amendment to the fiat dollar we use today. Without Roosevelt's inflation authority, Nixon's decision would have been politically unthinkable and legally uncertain. But with the precedent already established, it was simply the next logical step in America's monetary evolution. And this brings us to a powerful realization. The Thomas Amendment wasn't just about rescuing an economy, it was about redefining sovereignty. Before it, the U.S. government's power was limited by gold. After it, there were no limits, only promises. What Senator Thomas framed as an emergency measure for farmers became a template for the modern state's most potent power, the ability to create and control money at will. The amendment didn't just authorize inflation, it authorized the age of managed economics, where governments tweak interest rates, adjust liquidity, and fine-tune the value of money like a thermostat. It is no exaggeration to say that the Thomas Amendment turned money from a measure of value into a tool of policy. And once that tool was created, it would never be surrendered. By the late 1940s, the direct legacy of the Thomas Amendment had faded from public discussion, but its influence had become the invisible scaffolding of the modern financial system. Every Federal Reserve decision, every Treasury intervention, and every debate about inflation versus growth can trace its intellectual ancestry back to that 1933 law. The world had moved on from the Great Depression, but the architecture of government power over money remained firmly in place. To understand how profound that change was, imagine going back to 1910, before the Fed, before fiat money. Back then, the US dollar was essentially a promise carved in gold. The government couldn't create more dollars without more gold reserves. Fiscal discipline wasn't optional. It was built into the system. But after the Thomas Amendment, discipline became a political choice, one that could be reversed whenever necessary. That shift explains why so many crises after the 1930s played out the same way. In the 1970s, when inflation exploded, President Nixon simply suspended gold convertibility, the final act in the story that began with the Thomas Amendment. During the 2008 financial crisis, when the banking system imploded, the Federal Reserve expanded its balance sheet by trillions, creating new money out of thin air. And in 2020, when the pandemic froze the global economy, the government printed and spent at levels unimaginable a century earlier. Each of those actions would have been legally or politically impossible without the precedent Roosevelt set. So, while the Thomas Amendment is mostly forgotten today, its fingerprints are on every dollar bill in circulation. That paper in your wallet is not just currency, it's the end product of an 80-year experiment in monetary sovereignty. It's a dollar unmoored from metal, backed not by scarcity but by trust, and controlled not by markets but by policy. But here's the deeper irony. The very tool that saved the U.S. economy in 1933 also planted the seeds of the instability we face today. By normalizing intervention, it encouraged governments and central banks to manipulate money whenever the economy slowed, effectively postponing pain rather than preventing it. Over decades, that created a world of perpetual stimulus, where every downturn is met with lower interest rates, more debt, and greater financial complexity. This cycle has a seductive logic. It feels like progress, but it's really dependency. The more central banks intervene, the more markets expect them to. The more debt governments issue, the more they must keep interest rates low to afford it. The more inflation rises, the more people turn to hard assets like gold, silver, or even Bitcoin. Ironically, echoing the pre-1933 mindset that money should be scarce, not printed. The Thomas Amendment didn't just change America's relationship with money, it changed our psychology. Before it, the average citizen saw inflation as theft and paper money as fragile. After it, inflation became policy, even a goal. Economists began to argue that a little inflation was necessary for growth. Central banks built entire models around managing that inflation. The old fear of devaluation was replaced with a faith in experts who claimed they could fine-tune the economy. And yet, history keeps reminding us that monetary manipulation comes at a cost. The great inflation of the 1970s, the housing bubble of the 2000s, and the current debt crisis all stem from the same root, the belief that money can be endlessly adjusted without consequence. The Thomas Amendment was the first major law to embody that belief, the first to say explicitly that value could be legislated. Think of it this way. The amendment turned money into a policy lever rather than a store of value, and once you accept that premise, everything else follows. Fiscal irresponsibility becomes easier because debt can always be inflated away. Political promises become cheaper because the government can always print to pay. Speculative markets thrive because liquidity is always available. It's an elegant illusion until confidence breaks. The irony is that Senator Elmer Thomas himself never intended to rewrite the foundations of global finance. His goal was practical: help farmers survive. But in the process, he unleashed an idea that would outlive him by centuries, that money could serve politics rather than restrain it. The amendment's inflation authority, meant to be temporary, became the cornerstone of every future economic rescue. By the time the Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971, the Thomas Amendment's legacy had fully matured. The world was now on a dollar standard, but not the dollar of 1933. A new kind of dollar, one backed by the U.S. government's credibility rather than its gold. And, just as Roosevelt had used his inflation powers to control domestic recovery, America now used its fiat dollar to control global finance. From World War II through today, that control has allowed the U.S. to finance wars, deficits, and bailouts without facing the same constraints other nations endure. But even this power has limits. As debt levels soar and inflation returns, economists are beginning to rediscover the very fears the Thomas Amendment dismissed. What happens when money is no longer anchored to anything real? What happens when trust erodes faster than governments can print? Those questions, first raised by gold standard advocates in 1933, are once again defining global debate. In many ways, the Thomas Amendment's shadow stretches into the 21st century more strongly than ever. Modern monetary theory, quantitative easing, and digital currencies are all descendants of the same mindset: that the state can and should control money to achieve social goals. Whether those goals are fighting unemployment, climate change, or financial instability, the underlying belief is identical: that money is a tool of policy, not a constraint on it. Yet, even as that idea dominates, cracks are showing. The rapid rise of alternative stores of value, from gold to crypto, reflects a growing unease. People instinctively sense that unlimited monetary manipulation cannot go on forever. In times of uncertainty, they reach back for the old anchor: scarcity, trust, and tangible value. That instinct is as old as money itself. So perhaps the lesson of the Thomas Amendment isn't simply about inflation or gold. It's about cycles of trust and betrayal. How every monetary system, no matter how clever, eventually reaches its breaking point when the public no longer believes. The amendment marked the beginning of the modern era of faith-based money. Whether it also marks the beginning of its end is a question still being written today. In 1933, Roosevelt told the nation, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." But if you listen closely, the real message of the Thomas Amendment was something different. The only thing that gives money value is belief, and that belief, fragile, powerful, and endlessly manipulated, is the foundation on which our entire economy still rests.